Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Allahumma faqihna fi ad-din wa 'allimna ta'wil ya Rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope everyone is doing well today, inshallah. Please let me know if you can hear me. I just want to make sure that the sound is working good, inshallah. Today, inshallah ta'ala, we will be starting the chapter of Al-Ijara, or leasing and hiring. And inshallah, we will cover the different rulings. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll cover the different types of ijara, the rulings that is required, the conditions that are required or that are essential for an ijara contract or a renting contract, and also we'll talk about what breaks a contract, or what consists or what can invalidate a contract of ijara, inshallah ta'ala. So let's start off, inshallah. So normally, just like we start off at any other chapter, we'll start off with what is al-ijara. So ijara, the definition of ijara by the scholars is a contract that is a temporary contract which is a service or a benefit for a known amount, so for a known amount of money, and for a known time period. So this type of contract is basically what we would call in English a rental agreement, or a rental contract. And the difference between an ijara contract and a normal contract, or a normal buying and selling contract, is that the ijara, as we know, or as renting is, it's a temporary contract and it's bound by time. So the main difference is that it is bound by time, and we'll go into some further differences, inshallah ta'ala. So the definition that the scholars give is it is a contract for a known benefit, a known service or a utility, for a known time and a known compensation. Number two is what are the evidences from the Quran and Sunnah for an ijara contract. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Qasas, قالت إحداهما يا أبت استأجره إن خير من استأجرت القوي الأمين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the story of Musa alayhi salam. And we know that from the story of Musa, what happened was he was running away from his village, or he was leaving his hometown, and he was traveling. And on his journey, he went through the desert, and he seen some people, and they were feeding their animals water. And then he noticed two women that were on the side, and they had their animals, but they were not approaching the water. And Musa alayhi salam, he went up to those women and he asked them, what's going on? Why are you guys here? Why aren't you feeding your animals water? And they said that, those men are very strong and they're not allowing us to, basically take our animals there, right? because obviously we know water is a commodity that's rare in the desert, right? So people will be fighting over it, etc. So they were not allowing these women to do so. So what did Musa alayhi salam do? Musa, since he was a strong man, he was a, he was a person that had confidence and that had that strength. He took the animals of the women and he went to the water and he fed them and he brought them back. And then the women went back to their father and they told them the story. And then one of them said, he said, قالت إحداهما, one of them said, يا أبتي استأجره, oh my father, استأجره, hire him. استأجر, or rent him, right? The word ijara, it can mean hire or rent, right? And when you hire someone, we'll go into that. When you're hiring someone, you're basically renting them for either a service, for something to do particular, like you pay someone to do a job, right? You have a plumbing job or you have something you want to do, you pay someone for that service, or you hire them based on time, right? So they're saying, Ya abati ista'jirhu, hire him. Inna khayra man ista'jarta al-qawiyyu al-amin. Indeed, the best one that you can hire is someone that is strong and trustworthy. And Musa alayhi salam, of course, had these two qualities. Now, what are some evidences from the Sunnah on the act of ijara, or on the contract of ijara? So, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in an authentic hadith in Sunan Ibn Majah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, أعطوا الإجارة أجره قبل أن يجف عرقه. Give the worker his wages before his sweat dries. And it doesn't literally mean, this hadith doesn't literally mean give the worker his wages before his sweat dries. Rather, it is what they call it's something to encourage you to pay them very quickly. Don't delay your payment when you've hired someone. So if you've hired someone, don't delay in paying him his wages, right? So this is from the evidence from the Sunnah that paying wages or ijara, this concept of ijara, is something that was known in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And also the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قال الله ثلاثة أنا خصمه يوم القيامة. 3 people I will be personally against on يوم القيامة. رجل أعطى بي ثم غدر. A person that used my name to give something or to promise something, and then he was treacherous. He did not fulfill that promise. So you're using the name of Allah in order to convince people that you're going to do this thing, to convince people that you're a trustworthy person, and then you do not fulfill your promise, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to take that personally on Yawm al-Qiyamah, and He will be against you. وَرَجُلٌ بَاعَ حُرًّا فَأَكَلَ ثَمَنَهُ. And a person that has sold a free person into slavery. And the third is وَرَجُلٌ إِسْتَأْجَرَ أَجِيرًا فَاسْتَوْفَى مِنْهُ وَلَمْ يُعْطِ أَجْرَهُ. And a person that hired someone and he worked them, he benefited from them, he made them work, and then he did not pay them their wages. So from this we see that just this concept of paying someone their wages on time, it's mentioned in the Sunnah. And lastly, we have an athar, a saying from Abi Sa'id, where he said, إِذَا اسْتَأْجَرْتَ أَجِيرًا فَأَعْلِمْهُ أُجْرَهُ. If you hire someone, then tell him his wages, what his wages will be. So when you hire someone, you should agree upon the wages beforehand, so that there's no discrepancies afterwards. So now we'll go into what are the differences between an ijara and a sale, or a renting and a sale. And I mentioned a couple of them, but there are still a few more differences that we haven't mentioned. So number one, the first thing is that ijara, an act of ijara, a contract of ijara, is the selling of a temporary benefit. And a sale is a transfer of ownership. So that's the first difference. And for example, when you hire a landscaping service, what do? You hire them and they come and they do their job and they leave. It's temporary, right? Their service is temporary. An example of a sale is you sell a house, for example. You sell that house and that is permanent, right? That's permanent. You're not going to go back to that house, right? Now, another difference is that the contract of an ijara contract, it does not dissolve by the death of any party. So if one of the two parties pass away, that contract is still valid and it still goes on. And we'll go into some more details, or we'll talk about them now actually. So the contract is inherited by the inheritors. So for example, the owner of a home passes away, and the renters, the renters have a 1-year lease on that home, right? The renters still have the right to occupy that home until the term of the lease is over. And it is the responsibility of the inheritors of that home to maintain the home and to provide the services, etc., that is required of the home. Another example on the flip side is a person is renting a home with his family, and the contract is for 1 year, right? Say Bilal, this person's name is Bilal. He's renting the home with his family, and the contract or the lease is 1 year. Now Bilal, the head of the household, he passes away after 6 months. The family still has the right to live in that home for the duration of the contract, and the landlord has no right to kick them out. Of course, they have to pay their rent, right? So the contract, the rental contract cannot be the rental contract cannot be dissolved by either of the parties losing sanity, and if this occurs, then it is the responsibility of the guardians of the contract. So if one of them loses, they become insane, or one of them passes away, then it goes to the inheritors and it goes to the guardians. The person that's responsible for that person. It transfers the responsibilities of that contract. The rental contract transfers to the next level of people. Now, there are two types of contracts. There are two types of ijara contracts. Number one is renting a property or utility. And this is like, for example, a car or a home or an animal. You rent a car for a certain period of time. You rent a home. You rent an animal, that they used to do, back in the days. And the second type is hiring a service or a skilled person, right? Or an employee, right? And the reality of an employee contract is an ijara contract. You're renting that person for that period of time, right? For 8 hours a day, or for 5 hours a day, or whatever it is, right? And when you hire a service, for example, you hire some contractors to come do some work in your home, it's a contract of ijara. You are hiring them, you're renting their services for them to complete a job. You're not buying something physical, right? But you're not buying, like you may pay them up front, but there's nothing tangible yet for you to transfer. There's no transfer of ownership, right? They're working and they're doing a skilled job for you, right? When can an ijara contract be nullified? So number one is if the thing that is being rented out is destroyed. So for example, a car is destroyed. It becomes burned, or it becomes destroyed, like physically. It's not there anymore, right? It blew up or exploded, etc. Then it's not usable. So therefore, the contract is nullified, right? Number two is when it becomes in an unusable state. So the difference between this and the first one, the destruction, is a car could have mechanical problems. For example, right? A house can have problems. It's not destroyed, but there's problems and it's not usable, right? That maybe has a leaky roof, right? So you can't use the house because too much water is leaking in. The house is still there, right? But you can't use it. The car may have an engine problem. It cannot start, so it's not usable, right? So in this case, the contract can be nullified, it can be broken, and the compensation will be up to that for the duration of the time that is used. So if you had a contract for 2 months, for example, you're renting a home for 2 months and then it becomes unusable, then you will pay for only those. It becomes unusable after 1 month, then you pay for only 1 month. And same with the car. If you rented it for, say, 2 weeks and you're only able to use it for 3 days, then you only pay for those 3 days. Inshallah ta'ala. The third is if it has an effective defect. So if there is some sort of defect in that particular item, in the car or in the home or in that thing that you're renting, for example, you're renting a tool and it doesn't work as it should work, right? Maybe it's a saw that should cut things very fast, but it's not cutting because the blade may be dull, right? So it's not cutting as fast, right? It still works, but it's defective, right? Same thing for a car. Maybe you rent a car, but maybe the brakes are not working too well. It's working, it's fine, but it's not working as 100%, right? So you're not able to use that item to its full capacity. So in this case, it is just like when you purchase something, there's a defect on it, and the defect has it's an effective defect. It's something that has an effect on the usage. Then you are able to return that item. So in this case, you're able to nullify the contract as well. So you can nullify the contract and take your money back, or you can choose on your own self to go ahead with the contract and you can use the item as is. It is up to you. Now we come to the topic of subleasing. So you've rented a home, you rented a very big home, and this home maybe has 5 bedrooms, it's able to, accompany maybe, 10 people inside. And you're renting this home now, and your family, you're renting it because your family was coming to the country and you wanted to prepare the home for them. And what happened is that you realize there's some sort of emergency back home and they cannot come anymore. What do you do, right? Now, what you can do is you can rent that out. You can sublease it to someone else, right? And this is something which is perfectly fine in the Sharia. You are allowed to sublease your home to someone else without the knowledge of the person that you rented it, as long as there is no clause in the contract preventing you from subleasing. And number 2 is as long as the rate of utilization is equal or less. And what do I mean here? Is the scholars, they mention that usually this is in the Middle East, it happens a lot, even here in North America. When you're renting a home, they would ask you how many people are going to be living in this home. So you tell them, okay, you have 5 children, your wife and 5 kids, right? And they say, okay, it's a big home, it can handle this, right? So the rent is based on that, right? Now, if you want to sublease it, you are allowed to sublease it to a family with 5 children and 2 adults, right? Or a family of 7 people, right? You're not allowed to sublease it to more than that, to something that would cause more usage than the original contract that was based on, right? So in what we said, we said a person is renting it for his 5 kids and his wife. So that would be a total of him and his wife. So 2 and 5 would be 7. So if he rents it to someone that has 6 kids and 1 wife, then that would not be allowed. You would have to either inform the owner and let him know, or you would have to pay the difference, for that person if he stipulates, if he charges the difference. And this is because it's known that if you have more people in a home, it will cause more destruction, it would cause more usage, and the wear and tear would be more, right? And this is not only for a home, but it's for any other item that you're renting, right? So, for example, you rent. The scholars also give the example of renting a farm, right? If you rent the land to someone to plant barley, then you're not allowed to sub-rent it to someone else to plant wheat, because wheat is more depleting to the land than barley. However, if you rented the land with the intention of planting wheat, and you told the owner this, and then you decide to sublease it to someone that's going to plant something which is less depleting, like barley or like something else, then that is fine, right? You could rent it out to someone else to plant wheat or to plant barley, up to you, right? So as long as the rate of utilization is equal or less, then there's no problem. And as long as there's no clause in the contract preventing you from subleasing, then that is fine, inshallah ta'ala. Also, if you sublease it to someone that uses more utilization than was agreed upon, or if you yourself use that property or that item that you're renting for more than it can carry, then you will be liable for any damages, and you will be responsible for that. So for example, you rent a car or a truck, it's rated for 5 tons, but you carry 6 tons or 10 tons on it, right? And then one of the shocks go bad, right? Now you are responsible for that shock to pay and to replace it, because you were the one that is going against the contract. Even if it hasn't been specified in the contract, this is normal. You don't go over, you don't put more weight on a car or on an animal or something that it can take, right? However, if you were renting the car or the truck, and you were using it for 5 tons or less than 5 tons, and then one of the shocks go bad just out of nowhere, just like that, because of wear and tear, then the owner is responsible for that. But if you abused it, then you are responsible for that. Finally, the leasee may lease back the asset to the owner in the first lease. So if, for example, if he chooses, however, they have to be paid on a spot basis, in order to not get involved in the contract of al-'ina. So I'll explain this. So for example, you rent a farm, right? You rent a farm, and you rent it for, say, $10,000 for the year, right? You rent this farm from Muhammad, and Muhammad now, he realizes that he needs his farm, right? He rented it to you for $10,000, but now he realized that he needs a farm to plant whatever he was planting. He rented it out, and he didn't realize that something happened where he needs his farm back. Can he go back and re-rent it from you? So the scholars say yes, he can re-rent it from you. However, he has to pay you back cash. It cannot be a deferred payment. And if it is a deferred payment, then it can fall into al-'ina, and this would be it would look like basically he's the customer is paying Muhammad, giving him a loan, and then Muhammad, for example, he agrees to re-rent the farm after and pay back after 2 years, right? And then he's paying back a greater amount after a longer time, right? So it would look like it is a contract of 'ina or a contract of ar-riba, right? So he has to pay back right there on the spot. He cannot delay the payment if he's re-renting it from the person that he leased the property to. So we come to the topic of liability. Who is liable for the rental property or the rental equipment when you rent it out? And what are the fiqh rulings regarding this? So for property, if the intent was the property or a unit or an equipment, then the owner is responsible for any damages as long as the renter has not transgressed or is negligent with that item. So the owner is responsible for all the wear and tear and to maintain the item. So if there's any liability insurance, then the owner must pay this, right? If it's for a home or if it's for equipment or a car, etc., right? The owner must pay that. So for example, a house is rented and there's a leaking pipe, then the owner is responsible to fix it, not the customer, not the renter, right? So that is for property. Number 2, for employment. Now you rent out, you have a worker, you're renting them for, for the day, right? You're paying them, a day job or whatever it is. You're paying them a salary for a month, and this employee, he destroys something in your facility. Who is responsible? So the contract of an employee is considered a contract of amana, an amana. And the employee is not responsible or liable for anything unless he purposely transgresses or is negligent on his job. So if something happens by accident, out of the will, just like that, then he is not responsible, right? So, furthermore, the scholars mention that a worker on duty is responsibility of his employee, of his employer, for that time that he is employed. So anything that goes bad, the asl is that the employer is responsible for anything that happens from that employee. So for example, a worker, part of his duties is to turn on the freezer, in the night. For example, he's working in a store and, in a restaurant, and they usually take all the extra meat and they freeze it for the next day, right? And he needs to turn the freezer on, or he needs to make sure the meat is in there so that it doesn't go bad, right? And that's part of his responsibilities, as part of his duties. And he forgets to turn the freezer on, or he forgets to put the meat in, right? In that case, he would be liable for all the food that goes bad, right? So in that case, he would be liable for the food that goes bad because it is part of his responsibilities to do so. If a worker, for example, dies or is injured because of an accident, then the employer is responsible, and he must compensate the worker for that for whatever happens. So the employer in that case would be responsible. Also, another example is, if you have a maid at home, right? And the maid, she breaks a glass, right? And it's not on purpose, it just happens that it slips out of her hand or something happens, but it's not caused on purpose. Then she's not responsible for that. She's not responsible for that. It has to be something that's done purposely, or something that's done in negligence or transgressing, doing something that you're not supposed to be doing. The third type of liability is the liability of people that have special skills, and this is referred to, or this is what they refer to for as people that are, for example, medical professions. They perform medical operations or circumcisions or hijama or anything where your skill is the thing that they are hiring you for, right? So you hire a person to do, you go to an operation room and the doctor is doing operating, he's operating on you. The reason why you're going to him, the reason why you've hired him, is to perform that special skill that only a few people have, right? So in this case, if it is a profession which requires some sort of speciality, right? And the scholars, they mention the medical field because this is the one that has the most repercussions. Then if a person does not know that profession well and he does it, then he is liable. The Prophet ﷺ said, "من تطبع ولا يعلم منه طب فهو ضامن." Whoever practices medicine and he is not known for practicing medicine, meaning he's not qualified, then he is ضامن, he is liable, he is responsible for anything that happens, right? And the scholars say that if he is an expert but his hand slips, right, he makes a mistake, then he is still liable, as destruction can be committed intentionally or mistakenly. Just as a child, when a child does something wrong, he steals or he breaks something, who's responsible? The child is not responsible. However, it goes back to their parents, to the father or the guardians of that child. They are responsible. So the responsibility has to be taken somewhere, right? Someone has to be accountable for the mistake, right? So either the doctor, he has insurance, or he's employed by someone, so his employer, but someone has to take responsibility for any mistake that happens in terms of medicine or anything that is that needs those special type of skills. So for example, a trained person is doing hijama, and the body that he is working on has an abnormal reaction, and there is an excess loss of blood which causes great sickness or causes death. The hajim, the person that is doing the hijama, is not responsible, right? He didn't do anything wrong. However, if he made a cut by mistake and that caused the problem, then he is responsible. Another example is a doctor. If he's doing surgery, he's qualified, but he cuts the wrong artery by mistake and causes the patient to bleed out and to die, then he is liable. And that would be considered khata. That would be considered a killing, murder by mistake. So he would have to pay, the blood money, but his life would not be online for taking a life, because it wasn't intentional murder. A skilled person working on someone's property, such as a tailor or a plumber or a carpenter, is liable if he is negligent or has transgressed or has made a mistake. So any type of trade or any type of skill that a person does and he makes a mistake or he does something wrong, then he is liable for his mistakes. And we will conclude with the next slide, inshallah ta'ala. And this is the conditions of a valid Ijara contract. So the scholars mentioned that there are 4 conditions for a valid Ijara contract. Number one is that the service must be, the service or the benefit must be known. So whatever you are renting, it must be, the service or the benefit must be known. Either the time, so the amount of time that you're renting the car for, or the amount of time you're renting that house for, or that machinery for, must be known, or the work must be specified. Or if you're hiring someone, then that work that he needs to do must be specified, right? So there's either 2 ways you can define this. Number one is by time, or by the job or the specified duty that he needs to complete. And knowledge can be known by seeing or description or whatever is customary, and known by the people. So for example, you're renting a home, and you don't need to stipulate in the contract that you can bring in your furniture and your belongings to the property, because this is customary. We all know that when you rent a home, you bring in your furniture and your property, right? However, if you're renting a residential property, and then by the customs of the people, you don't use a residential property for a workshop or for a car garage or for a car parking, where you bring in cars and you park a bunch of cars and you charge them money, right? A residential property is not used for that normally, right? So if you're going to do that, then you need to stipulate this in the contract, right? So you must tell them, it must be known, and you must tell them what you're using the property for, if it goes against the customs of the people, right? If you go over the limit of your contract, then you are liable and you must pay for the difference. So for example, you're renting a car for, and you rent it for 100 kilometers, you're allowed to use 100 kilometers usage, but you go and you use it for 200 kilometers, then you must pay the difference, of course, right? And usually the contracts for rental companies have this built in. Right? So now what about if you don't know the amount of time that you'll be using, this type of service? So for example, an internet service where they provide you unlimited usage, right? Or an open buffet, right? It's not known how much food you're going to use. It's not known how much internet bandwidth you'll be using. What's the ruling on this? Are you allowed to indulge in these services? So the scholars have mentioned that this is like they would use in the past. They would have this service called the hammam, the shower, and you would pay a certain money and you would go into the hammam, the shower. And the amount of soap you use is not known, and the amount of water you use is not known. But how do they base the amount? Is they average it, right? And similarly here, when they're pricing the internet and when they're pricing, a buffet, they usually price it by the average amount of, what type of food it is and how much people would normally eat when they come in, right? And there would be people that would eat more than the norm, and there would be some people that come in and they would eat less than the norm, right? So it would equal out. So they have an average and they have an idea. So the scholars have mentioned that this is jahalatun mughtafer. It is an unnoticed, but it is forgiven, right? It is something which is forgiven, and this is the fatwa of Sheikh Salman Rahili and some of the other mashayikh that have spoken about these type of contracts. The second condition is that the service must be halal. So whatever you're leasing, it must be halal. And number two is that the person that you're leasing it to must not be performing any haram actions or using it for a haram purpose. And for example, you have a property, you have a building, and you're not allowed to lease it to a bank or to a wine company or to a beer company, right? This is haram, right? However, you lease it to someone and then they do some haram things, inside, and that was not stipulated in the contract. It's not something that right? Then whatever is behind the doors, you lease your house to someone and they decide to do something haram in there, you are not responsible for that, right? But generally, if a person comes to you and he tells you, and it's clear, there are clear signs that this person is using your property for haram, he'll be using this item for haram, then you are not allowed to lease him that service. Just like when you're selling services or when you're selling an item to someone, it's the same concept here. Number three is the compensation must be known. And we spoke about this in the definition, that the compensation must be known prior to the execution of the contract. And and before receiving any benefit or any work has been started, the compensation must be known. The rent must be known, or the wage must be known before anything has started. And it can be, the scholars have mentioned that it can be a fixed rate or it can be a variable rate. And a variable rate meaning that, for example, sometimes when you're renting a property or you're renting, especially for like a commercial property, you want to rent it, the renter, if it's a No Frills, if it's if it's a Walmart, if it's some big company, they want to ensure that they have that place for a good amount of time. They may rent it for 5 years or for 10 years or 15 years, 20 years at a time, right? Because it's a lot of investment for them to build that entire place and to bring millions of dollars of product, into that area, right? So if you're renting to a company or to someone, they may want to rent it for a very long time. And you're not going to rent it 5 years down the line the same amount that you're renting it today, because rent prices go up and they go down, right? So what the scholars have mentioned is that you can use a benchmark. So there are benchmarks where you can align your rent towards that benchmark, and you basically use that as a guideline. So for example, the inflation rate, maybe it goes up 3% or 5% after 5-10 years, right? Your rent will go up, of course, right? Because cost of living, cost of expenses will go up, right? And if you've aligned your rental price at that benchmark, then it will automatically go up, and there will be no problem there, inshallah ta'ala, as long as it is agreed between both parties, right? Secondly, if there is no agreement for compensation, then the compensation will be fair market price. So for example, this happens a lot. You get off a train or you get off the airport, and there are people that come and they want to take your bags, right? So someone comes up and he says, look, would you like me to take your bags for you? Right? And you say yes, right? And they take your bag, and then you, they take it to wherever you need to take your bags to, right? There's no agreement between you two how much you're going to pay him, right? So what do you need to pay him? What do you owe him? You owe him the market value, whatever is the fair market value that is normally paid to a person like that, to a bellboy, to a person that is, a carrier. Then you pay him, right? That is fine. The finally, for the compensation, if a person does not pay his rent or he fails to pay on time, then a person can stipulate in the contract that the Ijara contract be terminated if there is no payment or the person fails to pay on time. However, in terms of compensation, there cannot be a late payment fee or an excess in the amount if a person fails to pay on time. So if a person fails to pay on time, you cannot charge him a late fee. However, you can stipulate that if you're late or if you miss a payment, then the contract is over and it's null, and then they have to leave. They cannot use that product, or they cannot occupy the home anymore. So that is how you can secure, secure your contract. Finally, the leaser or the landlord must own the property, or he must be legally allowed to transact with that property or with that equipment that he is renting. So he can be either the owner, he can be an agent, or he can be a guardian of the owner. So for example, if children, they own a property, and the guardian of those children, like they are yatim, they could be orphans. The guardian of the orphans are the one that must transact that property. He can rent the property, the home out, or he can be responsible. He can be a nadr of a waqf, for example, a person that is responsible for a waqf, right? He's renting out, the property that is a waqf, right? So he has to be the owner, or he has to be legally allowed to transact that property. And ownership is possible under a sale contract, even if the title is not registered to the purchaser's name. So when we talk about ownership, we're talking about the reality of the owner, right? And now, at times, it may happen that a home may be registered in someone else's name, but the real owner is someone else. So the person that is the real owner is allowed to transact that property, and not the person that owns the title. So it's the actual owner, and we said that al-ibra fil is, the ibra, what we go by in Islam is the actuality, and not what is written on paper. Because sometimes there are certain circumstances where you may put someone else on the title, and that person in reality is not the owner. For example, if you're living in a country where only citizens are allowed to purchase homes, right? And a foreigner wants to purchase a home, he may purchase it using a citizen, one of his friends' name on the title, right? So that's a classical example. It doesn't necessarily go by the title, but whoever is the actual owner, he is allowed to sell and transact that property. Wallahu a'lam, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. If there are any questions, please submit them now in the chat, inshallah. Otherwise, we will break, inshallah, and we will continue next week, inshallah ta'ala.